People watch news or they pick up and buy a newspaper because they want to see what's changed today, what's dramatic about the events in the world today. And so inevitably they will tend to focus on things like wars and disaster when they're thinking about the rest of the world, rather than that kind of long-term story about development. So in a sense, you could argue the pressure actually comes from the audiences. It's also, of course, from the journalists who want to have an attention-grabbing programme or newspaper. And so there's a combination there. And it's also fuelled, in a way, by, for example, NGOs, who also realise that the dramatic story is what's going to persuade people to give money to charities, rather than a rather boring long-term story about long-term development. I think there's always a danger of expecting perhaps too much from what is quite a narrow formula of daily news. Also, we can expect too much from the public. They don't want to know everything about everything all the time, but we can develop much more sophisticated and diverse ways to reach people who are interested, and if they want to follow up and they need more context so they understand not just what's happening, but why is it happening and has it happened before, then you might take people into a situation where they might also ask, and what can I do? Can I be involved? Is this something that I can actually do something about? I think in the past we always, in the West, thought that you could somehow export the model of the BBC, for example, or great newspapers like the New York Times into developing countries, for example, in Africa. But what we're actually seeing is that people are using much more participatory social media networks to build kind of much more network journalism in developing countries that's able to get around some of the censorship, that's able to get around some of the corruption, and that's able also to get over some of the infrastructural barriers. So you may have real problems in many developing countries over simple things like electricity or more structural problems like education. And social media, social networks, that kind of participatory communication allows people to collaborate more. It has much lower barriers of entry. You need far less capital invested. And so you are seeing a kind of organic growth of network journalism across developing countries. I think that any journalist, their first responsibility is to try and do their basic job well. And in the context of international affairs, that's to witness and report as truthfully and as honestly as they can what they see and what they understand is going on. But especially with international affairs, which are always subject to stereotype and cliche and even prejudice, it's really important that the journalists question themselves as much as questioning other people, and think through, do I really understand some of the context and some of the background to what's going on? And am I being properly sceptical about the official line that I'm being given, perhaps from the Foreign Office or perhaps from Oxfam? And am I thinking beyond the cliches, especially in a world where we've got the internet and a much greater diversity of platforms, different ways of reaching people? I think that we can look to journalism in the broader sense to tell other stories, to tell more complicated stories, to find the more complex, deeper explanations, because for some parts of the audience at least, they are going to be more interested in perhaps a more sophisticated analysis and perhaps a richer understanding of what's happening in their world. But I don't expect the mass media to change overnight, but I think we could be much more innovative about thinking of different ways of telling different stories.